Well, hello there, and welcome to another Infinite Inning reissue episode. This week, we go back to year 2 of the program for episode number 72. Normally, when we've done these revisits, I've trimmed out all mention of the guests, but this time I'm going to leave it in just because the subject we discussed in the conversation section is pertinent to what I talked about in the first part of the show. My guest was the journalist Stephen Johnson, then with the Amsterdam News and The Athletic. I enjoyed talking to him, and I should have had him on again. I did look for other opportunities to do so, but I think his career went in another direction, and I never found the opportunity. He had written a piece about the difficulties of being a black fan. This was back in 2018. I was inspired to riff on this subject before I went into the second story of the episode. Now, keep in mind, this was September 2018. The horrible murder of George Floyd had yet to happen. It was more than a year and a half in the future. There was already a Black Lives Matter movement, but that idea took on a new salience after this very obvious example of police misconduct. You will recall, it's hard to forget it, that there were nationwide protests, some of which were frightening in their intensity. And not just the intensity of the protests themselves, but often the intensity of the police response. I feel like, given what was just around the corner from when we had this conversation, my comments here sound oh so very quaint, and yet I don't want to delete them from the record. We are still living in the aftermath of those protests. I think that, as much as the election of Richard Nixon in 1968 was at least partially a reaction to the Watts riots of 1965, the Harlem riots of, I believe, the year before, not that long before, and other examples of Black Americans protesting at that time. The eventual re-election of you-know-who in our own day was part of the aftermath, the backlash, the counter-revolution to those more recent protests. It is as certain as night follows day that when minority populations in America push for recognition of their rights, and no matter who instigates the violence that ends up in riots, the mainstream hungers for law and order, which is just a metaphor. It's just a way of saying, hit those rioters over the head. Even if they have a point, hit those rioters over the head. We don't like broken glass. We don't like fires. And it's fair not to like violence. It's fair to be worried if violent acts are happening down the street from you simultaneously. That does not absolve you of the responsibility of understanding why it is all happening in the first place. And again, to understand reaction and counter-reaction, and to know that in every group of people, whether they have a point or not, or I should say whether they have a point that you agree with, there is a spectrum that runs from the nonviolent to the violent, and from people who are simply looking to say what they need to say, and people who are looking for license to act out. And when you put police officers and angry people, again, their anger may be justified, when you put them together and you have that spectrum clashing, you're going to have these outbreaks. And again, I'm not justifying them. I'm not saying that they're good. I'm just saying it doesn't indict the whole cause. It doesn't indict everyone on either side. But because people react so strongly to it, it creates a vicious cycle. And what happens is the mainstream, as I said, hungers for law and order. Suppression then results, which has the effect of reloading the same energies, the same pressures that led to the crisis in the first place. One of the few times America was actually intelligent enough to move past that cycle was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, now being systematically, fatally dismantled by the Supreme Court. And so we rewind the clock, but Martin Luther King Jr. won't be coming again, and we await what James Baldwin referred to as the fire next time, which in turn will lead to more repression, which in turn leads us to a darker place as a people as a whole, and nothing ever gets better. Hallelujah! You know, in our world, the Ewoks never get to dance. They're deported, and they end up on the sidewalks in various cities around the galaxy with a cup and a sign that says, "Homeless bear, please donate." Yub nub? Yup, nub. In preparing these remarks, I came across an unexpected baseball-oriented reaction to the Watts riots of the summer of 1965, and I will talk about that in this week's new episode of The Infinite Inning, number 349, which is due to emerge from the Infinite Inning Labs approximately 24 hours after I post this here episode. I don't know if that story goes anywhere, but it seems as if, as I've already detailed, when we're talking about these kinds of events in American history, the not going anywhere is the whole point. Today's reissue not only includes the mutterings I referenced a moment ago, but a discussion of 1930s and 40s left-hander Fritz Ostermuller and his many injuries. If Ostermuller comes up today, or maybe it's Ostermuller, again, I wasn't there. If Fritz comes up today, it's as a Jackie Robinson antagonist in 1947. This was at the beginning of Robinson's National League career and the penultimate season of Ostermuller's, Fritz's. Fritz did hit Jackie with a pitch in 1947, but there's no real evidence of it having been intentional. I'm not exonerating him. I just don't know. Just like today, 80 years ago, a number of white Americans, ballplayers among them, felt that being out and proud in their bigotry, in their gatekeeping, was a totally appropriate response to black Americans asking to play baseball and be allowed to vote. Even now, in our thoroughly degraded era, it's shocking to read that at the time, not 47, 64, that Mississippi Governor Paul Johnson, who was in office from 64 to 1968, was in the habit of telling voters that the acronym NAACP stood for N-words, alligators, apes, coons, and possums, except he didn't say N-words. He said the whole thing right out loud, right there on radio and television. This is a low bar, but Fritz doesn't seem to have been one of those. Fritz was a 30-WAR career pitcher. I suppose there have been enough of those that it's not that special of an accomplishment. That said, there have been a lot more careers of 1 WAR or 0 WAR or negative WAR than there have been of 30, and in that context, 30 seems pretty special after all. He spent the first 7 years of his career, 1934 through 1940, with the Red Sox and pitched to a 4.38 ERA, which sounds mediocre, but if you park and league adjust that, as Baseball Reference does, you get an ERA plus of 110. That is, he was 10% better than league average. Ask yourself, how many pitchers in Red Sox history have thrown a minimum of 1,000 innings with an ERA plus of 110 or better? The answer is, out of 124 years of the team's existence, 20. The list begins with Pedro Martinez, passes through Smokey Joe Wood, Cy Young, Roger Clemens, and Lefty Grove, and eventually makes its way down to Bill Lee and our Mr. Fritz. Josh Beckett, Clay Buchholz, and Dennis Eckersley are so close to them as to be indistinguishable. It's a pretty impressive list to be part of. For our second tale, we stayed in New England for the devastating hurricane of 1938, and a game Casey Stengel managed right in the teeth of that storm. It's an amusing story, but there was nothing funny about the hurricane itself. As I note, warnings from the National Weather Service regarding the storm's intensity were inadequate, and as a result, people died. As I was preparing to speak these words just now, literally this minute, I saw on Blue Sky a note from today, October 16, regarding this weekend's Dolphins-Browns game and a forecast with a 94% chance of rain and 36-mile-per-hour wind gusts. Although the poster says, and who knows if they know what they're talking about, but if the storm strengthens, those gusts could get up to 50 or 60 miles per hour. And that means that a quarterback could throw the ball downfield and potentially catch it himself after the wind pushes it right back at him. It could also mean that the goalposts come down on his head. That's what I mean when I say that that baseball game was amusing in the abstract, and amusing is weird baseball, but tragic when considered in the full context of a storm that did massive economic and human damage up and down the east coast of the United States. But today's version, the one that I just gave you about the Dolphins-Browns game, is an example of us getting something like adequate warning today. If you're in Cleveland, you can decide to go to that game or not go. To put boards over your windows if you think that strong winds are going to launch tree branches, or, heaven forfend, a Cybertruck at your windows. Absent that, you'd be as informed as the old-time farmer saying, "Bring in the sheep, Maud. Sky looks ominous. We'd best put the livestock in the living room and spend the night in the cellar. Don't forget to put Dick Cavett on for the goats. He calms their nerves." This is an example of the significant truth that we together can accomplish things we cannot achieve individually. Among them, having useful safety things like a National Weather Service or air traffic controllers. Are your taxes too high? Yeah, mine too. But this is part of why we pay them. And it's no fun working hard and having to give that money away, but we're not giving it away. We're buying something with it, Ringo. We're buying our lives. That's all for me for this reissue episode. I'll be back a little bit later to paper over the odd break and say sayonara at the end of the episode. As always, thank you for joining me for this reissue of The Infinite Inning, which begins right after this brief intermission. Somewhere in the infinite inning, there's a bullet with your name on it, and it's not just any ordinary bullet, it's more like a guided missile. You can't duck it, it's fate. You experience the grim, despairing acceptance that this bullet is no different from a dinner at Applebee's. You may not have done anything to deserve it, but at this late hour, it's the only path that's open to you. In the 1930s, the Red Sox had a left-handed pitcher named Fred Fritz Ostermuller. He came to the majors in 1934 as a 26-year-old after spending about 8 years in the minor leagues. The Sox, who were building under new owner Tom Yawkey, had signed him after he had a big season at Rochester of the American Association. And you know what? He did pretty well straight off the bat. He only went 10-13 his rookie year, and you know that back then wins and losses were one of the major measures, if not the only measure of a pitcher's success, but it was recognized that he had a better season than the record indicated. For one thing, his 3.49 ERA was well below league average and was even more impressive when you factored in that he was a left-hander in Fenway Park with the Green Monster to worry about. So his future would have seemed to be set, and indeed he had a prominent place in the 1935 Red Sox rotation, a collective that observers at the time believed would make the Sox strongly competitive that year because it wasn't just Ostermuller who was looked on to have a good sequel to his first season, but they had Lefty Grove and Wes Ferrell as well, the same Wes Ferrell who we discussed extensively in just last week's episode. Now, as it turned out, the Red Sox were only a few games over 500, and part of it was that the rotation turned out not to be all that. As far as the top three that I just mentioned went, Ferrell was great, went 25-14 with a 3.52 ERA over 322.1 innings. You won't see that again, as I often say. And Grove also was quite good, better even, going 20-12 with a 2.70 ERA. As for Fritz, his ERA was 3.92, which was still very good at that time and that place. The problem was he could only make 19 starts, and it wasn't because manager Joe Cronin dropped him from the rotation for non-performance. It's simply that someone up there didn't like him. Now, I have to confess that I'm a little bit fuzzy on exactly how some of this went down, specifically this first part. He was pitching batting practice in late April when a batter, and I haven't been able to ascertain who it was, lined a ball off of his knee. According to newspaper reports published right there and then in Boston, so it's not like they would have forgotten or done sloppy research, the resultant injury kept him off the field for 3 weeks. The box scores showed no such timeout. So let's assume that they were exaggerating and that whereas he was not shelved, there wasn't really a formal disabled list at the time, that he did struggle with the injury. Although those same box scores show him pitching quite well. By the end of May, and his May ended early for reasons I'm about to tell you, he had an ERA of 3.06. Now, this part I am certain about. On May 25th, at Fenway Park, he was facing the Detroit Tigers. The Detroit Tigers had a rather powerful right-handed hitter you might have heard of named Hank Greenberg. And in the top of the fourth, Greenberg lined a ball up the middle and off of Ostermuller's left cheek. He hit it so hard that the ball rebounded into right field. Ostermuller did get off the field mostly under his own power. He didn't have to be carried off. He had to be helped off, braced by his teammates. He needed a couple of stitches under the eye, but there was no thought that he was about to go Ray Chapman on the world. In fact, the initial prognosis was he'll be back in no time. He's fit as a fiddle, right as rain. But that's when the concussion symptoms started showing up. The dizzy spells and headaches and nosebleeds. They told him to stay in bed for a while. After about 3 weeks, they thought they'd give it a try, and he pitched against the Yankees, and he actually won. He pitched a complete game, allowed only 2 runs. But here's another thing I'm not quite sure about, except that I know it was bad. It was at that point that he had another ball lined off of his knee in batting practice, and this time I know who it was. It was utility infielder Dib Williams. They had great names in the 1930s. That resulted in Ostermuller having to have his leg in a splint. It wasn't broken, but there was kind of a bad bruise and nerve injury that required some healing time. Now, was that the same batting practice injury that resulted in the timeout from April? Or were the April reports just confused? I mean, it would require a time machine to screw that up before the injury in June. I really am very confused about this. What is certain is that this time the statistical record matches what was reported in the papers, because after that June 8th start, Ostermuller disappeared for about 5 weeks. But once again, he got better. He rehabbed, however pitchers rehabbed in 1935, hopefully by going off to Spain and fighting the fascists or something. But in any case, he came back in relief on July 12th, and on July 14th, he pitched a 10-inning complete game over the Cleveland Indians, ended in a 2-2 tie. Oh well. But still, he's back. He's finally healthy. Everything is finally going Fritz Ostermuller's and the Red Sox way. That is, it was, until August 18th at St. Louis. Ostermuller pitches another complete game, a win over the Browns. But here's the thing. In the first inning, he had to face the Browns outfielder Moose Salters. Moose Salters really wasn't much of a moose as baseball players go. I mean that in a production sense. He came up very late, had a couple of good years, and then was kind of just a league average guy. But in any case, it doesn't take a slugger to do damage to a pitcher. And Ostermuller, the human pincushion, has another ball lined off of his body. This time, Moose Salters hits it off of his leg. As far as I can tell, it's the same leg that Dib Williams had injured a couple of months before. But you know what? Ostermuller laughs it off. Ha ha ha. He's fine. He keeps pitching. As I said, it was a complete game. And after that, he takes his next turn in the rotation on just 2 days rest, pitches pretty well again, also throws a game in relief and picks up a save and makes yet one more complete game start, time against the Indians in Cleveland, and again pitches the team to a win. He's got a 3.62 ERA, which again by 1935 standards is great. But while warming up for that game, or the game after, again, the newspaper reports seem to indicate it was that game, the game where he threw 9 innings at the Indians, that he suddenly found himself unable to walk. And it was only at this point that somebody said, hey, maybe we ought to take an x-ray of that leg of Fritz's, you know, the one that Moose banged the ball off of. A ball that rebounded so hard, by the way, that it had to be fielded by Red Sox second baseman Ski Melillo. And if you listened to last week's show, no, I did not plan for Ski Melillo to make an encore just 7 days on. We're just doing Ski Melillo all the time from now on. It's the infinite Ski Melillo. The x-rays came back, and it turned out that for a period of about 2.5 weeks, Ostermuller had been pitching on a broken fibula. For those who cut class at medical school today, that's the thin leg bone that runs from your knee down to your foot. It's not the big bone of your leg. It runs along your calf. any other organization at any other time in history subsequent to that might have said, look, let's call a halt to the proceedings at this point until we can do kind of an investigation and figure out which deity Fritz Ostermuller has angered that has put him in the position of having balls continually hitting him about the head, shoulders, legs, and other extremities. But no, they didn't handle it that way. Ostermuller sat out about 4 weeks, and on September 22nd, with 5 games left in the season, they brought him back to pitch against the Yankees at home at Fenway Park. The Yankees beat the hell out of him, but at least it was in the conventional way. He gave up a whole bunch of hits and runs and added a third of a run to his ERA for the season, but he didn't get hurt or any more hurt, so I guess you could consider that a moral victory. Some pitchers will go a whole year without getting hit by a batted ball. I imagine there are some fly ball types who might not see a comebacker for years at a time. Sid Fernandez, say, is always my exemplar for that kind of pitcher. And sure, Ostermuller was a contact-oriented pitcher at a more contact-oriented time. There's no disputing that there were more chances for a pitcher to be decapitated by a line drive off the bat of Hank Greenberg or numerous other hitters. Still, that the baseball would find you 3 to 4 times, depending on how we eventually work out the chronology to this story, is unlikely. And maybe you don't believe in predestination, maybe you don't believe in fate, maybe you don't believe that people get their just rewards or even their unjust rewards. But in many ways, that's an even scarier world than one in which, to borrow from Jonathan Edwards, we are all sinners in the hands of an angry God. No, in fact, we're just in the grip of the infinite inning, and randomness happens, and it might just be that against all odds, your number doesn't come up once, but over and over and over again, and there's no reason for it at all. Ask Fritz Ostermuller. I'm Stephen Goldman, and this is The Infinite Inning. Well, hello there. Welcome back to the show. Let's get right into it. This week, I am joined by Stefan Johnson, staff writer for the New York Amsterdam News, one of the longest-running black newspapers in the country, and has also written about baseball for The Athletic, The Hardball Times, and most recently, The Week, where he published a column on the difficulties of being a black fan in 2018. And this caught my eye, and I wanted to discuss it with him. And I was well rewarded for extending that invitation, as we had a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. There is a lot to chew on there if you haven't considered perspectives other than your own. And to just preview one bit that hadn't really occurred to me to think of it this way. Back a long time ago now, when Carlton Fisk was getting on Deion Sanders for not playing the game the right way, and when Buck Showalter did the same to Ken Griffey Jr. for having his hat tilted during batting practice or having it on backwards during batting practice, I viewed each of those events as an isolated incident, and I also tried to understand the attitudes of Fisk and Showalter, because as someone who even then was versed in the history of the game and had kind of bought into this ancient ethos about not showing up other players and playing the right way. But what I failed to consider, I want to say this without sounding precious. You might think that because I've told a ton of stories on this show about the pernicious effects of segregation on baseball, that I would analyze everything, that my first instinct would be to look at these kinds of interactions through the lens of race. But you know what? At least at that age, I didn't. still a teenager and not having encountered many overt racists in my own life, certainly not as many as you can now encounter on any given afternoon just by tuning into the wrong website or social media account. And also, I think, having bought into kind of a liberal fantasy on account of the way I was raised. I was raised to believe that racism is wrong, that you judge people as people, not on the basis of their skin color. And I also had some African American playmates from a very young age. And so it never occurred to me to think that way. And I was born after the Civil Rights Act, after Martin Luther King, after a lot of things had changed. Both my parents can recall a world that was segregated. My world was not, at least not legally, not in terms of having signs that said blacks only or whites only, which they both had seen at times, being obviously much older than me. And so I think some of the message I got, not just from them, but from school and people around me, was, look how much better things are. Look how all that stuff is over with now. And it doesn't mean it was all over. It doesn't mean the majority of it was over. We're seeing that now every single day. But I guess understandably, at least for the white people around, they could say, at least from their perspective, that, yeah, a lot of the wrongs had been righted. Again, just to be really clear, they were wrong. They were so wrong. It was just, those were the parts they could see because they were the obvious ones. They were the ones that got on the evening news. And since the people around me were not racist to begin with because it was alien to their way of thinking, they didn't see the other stuff, the stuff that we see now, the stuff that people say casually all the time in tweets and in Facebook posts and so on. So great. I was a child, and if I was naive and complacent and basically well-intentioned where those things are concerned, hooray for me. I'm wonderful. But that's not my point. My point is actually that when you are complacent, just because you're not thinking like an oppressor doesn't mean that you can discount the views of the oppressed. And I guess this is a long way of saying that what didn't occur to me at those times was not just the message or the baseball aspects of what Fisk and Showalter were saying, but about who was saying it and who they were saying it to. And when you have an accumulation of those messages, how it might be communicated to the whole group of African American players. In the same way that when an Ian Kinsler says today or nearabouts to today, well, the Latinos don't play the game the same way we do, and they're more demonstrative, and that doesn't really fit in here. It's totally fine for you to err on the side of generosity. It may not always be deserved, but let's go with that with someone like Kinsler and say, hey, let's just take it at surface value. He meant what he meant, and he wasn't trying to be a racist in any sense or a cultural chauvinist. He was just saying that this is his view of the way that professional ball players comport themselves. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but regardless, you have to take into account how that message might be received by the people he's talking about. Does it make them feel welcome or unwelcome? Does it pile in with an accumulation of years and years of other such incidents? And with African Americans, we can rewind that to the 1600s, if not before. And ask, will they hear this as just one more white person saying that their way of doing things or they themselves are inferior in some sense? And I didn't really get that until much later. And because I hadn't thought of the Fisk or Showalter things in a very long time, I hadn't really framed them in that way until this show. So when you hear us talking about it later, there's a real sense of discovery on my part. And I hope that for those of you who haven't thought through the social media stuff, particularly the tweets by Josh Hader and the gang. And then you might join us as we talk in this episode about why African American participation, both from a fan and a player perspective, is down so far from where it used to be. You might say to yourself, you know, each of those tweets by themselves is just one thing. It's just one Josh Hader. It's just one Trey Turner, and so on. But you put them together with everything else, and it's a piling on that is so big that you couldn't fit it in the biggest skyscraper. And I should have figured that out years ago because you know what? I am Jewish, and when I hear anti-Semitism, I don't just hear one incident. I don't just say to myself, that's one jerk. I hear 5,000 years of stuff. I hear 1932 to 1945. That's what I hear. Do I sound unusually squeaky back in 2018? I don't remember feeling squeaky. Maybe everyone's a little bit squeaky now and again. Just having occasional squeaky inclinations doesn't make you totally squeaky, it just makes you human. And that makes this a break. I'll be back with more from episode 72 in just a moment. A couple of words on hurricanes. As I record this on Friday afternoon, Hurricane Florence is still down in the Carolinas, dumping rain and wind. Although I guess I misspoke. It's down to a tropical storm. It's Tropical Storm Florence. So it's been demoted a rank. It's been busted. But still, it's a problem. And I just wanted to point out that 1 week from today, 80 years ago, 1 week from today, on September 21st, that a similar thing was going on. It was a busy day in the world. Chamberlain was in Munich negotiating with Herr Hitler, working up towards that peace in our time moment that worked out so well. He was about to sell out the Czechoslovakians in exchange for that worthless piece of paper. And over here, they were trying to play some baseball up in New England. In fact, they were trying to play baseball everywhere and not doing a great job at it because it was a very wet late summer and fall. It was also unusually hot. And that was a problem because there was a hurricane down in about the same spot that Florence is in. It was a typical hurricane. It formed off of Cape Verde in Africa, where so many of them form, and it zipped across the Atlantic going east to west, and it wound up in the Carolinas, Florida's neighborhood. And then there was the question of what it was going to do after that. And history had taught the National Weather Service, such as it was at that time in this sort of analog age when there were no satellites and not jet airplane evaluations and so on. They were kind of winging this, and it was half reports of ships at sea and maps and charts and maybe the twitching in your leg from that old war wound in trying to figure out what these things would do. But they knew that hurricanes, for the most part, 99.9% of the time, that matched the description I just gave you, always curved out to sea, just as they talked about Florence curving out to sea before, well, it didn't. And one guy with the National Weather Service, a younger guy, understood that on September 21st, 1938, that this hurricane sitting off the Carolinas was not going to curve out to sea. That, in fact, weather conditions had accumulated where there was almost going to be a tunnel created where it could just shoot right up the East Coast. But he was overruled because, again, the weight of hurricanes, or history of hurricanes, and the weight of people's twitching legs was such that it never, ever happened. But as it turned out, he was right, and so no one was told. There was no warning, and it all happened very, very quickly. This hurricane moved straight south to north at 60 miles an hour and covered the entire distance from the Carolinas to Long Island in New York in the space of about 7-8 hours. And so in the late afternoon of September 21st, people were doing all the beach type things that people typically do. And they had no idea when the skies got dark. They just thought, oh, thunderstorm. They didn't realize that a Category 5 hurricane was bearing down on them. There were no evacuations. There was nothing of that sort. And even if they had tried, it wouldn't have worked out because since no one thought of these gigantic storms as having a tendency to occur at higher latitudes, they had built right out to the water. Not that this has really changed in any way, but they had built these flimsy structures, or relatively speaking, flimsy structures right out to the water's edge, right up the East Coast. And so this hurricane obliterated Montauk and Long Island and then rolled up through Connecticut into Rhode Island, which was just absolutely devastated, and up into Massachusetts. There are countless documentaries on this hurricane, and I urge you to watch some of them. They are absolutely harrowing in terms of what people went through, clinging to these houses that are built on sand on the beach, and 40 and 50-foot waves are coming at them, and they know that either they are going to die or the people that they can see out their windows are going to die, or both. And very often they did. Roughly 700 people are thought to have died in this storm, and about 450 of them, I think, my numbers could be off slightly, but the majority of them, over 400, I believe, died in Rhode Island. And you read these descriptions of people who, one moment they had their wife standing next to them, or one moment they were looking at their kids coming home on the school bus, and then there was some kind of wave, and then their wife was no longer standing beside them, or the school bus was no longer there, and that they had to go out after the water receded and look for bodies, and it might be days until they found them. And so there were funeral after funeral sequentially as more people came in. It was truly a nightmare, and it was worse than that. I mean, there were towns that burned because the damage caused fires. There were towns that were underwater and were looted. Downtown Providence, for example. And this is just sort of trivial compared to the loss of life. But there was a timber industry in New England before this storm, and after, there wasn't, because they lost 275 million trees. These forests that had existed beforehand did not exist after. And yes, they salvaged a good amount of the fallen timber, but that was that. There's no renewal in a forest that has been completely uprooted. Now, some of the cities along the way, they only got swiped by the hurricane. The boardwalk at Atlantic City got ripped up, but it wasn't like what happened to Providence. New York City also got brushed. They had incredibly high winds and quite a bit of flooding, but again, not a total disaster. And Boston also got off kind of light. It was on the northern edge of all this that was happening. The hurricane by then had given out a little bit and ultimately drifted up to Canada and rained itself out of existence. But again, there had been no warning, and the Boston Braves had a doubleheader scheduled at home that day with the St. Louis Cardinals. So no one told them, even though it was a rainy, miserable-looking day, not to play these games. Very few people even showed up. The official attendance was 1,356, and even that was thought to have been an exaggeration. But Bob Quinn, who was the front man for the Braves at that time, had a thing about, if anybody shows up to see the game, we owe them a game. So I think if two people had been there, if one person had been there, he would have opened the gates. So they did play the first game. They got the first game in incredibly wet and windy conditions that were the edge of the hurricane. The Cardinals shut out the Braves 4-0. It wasn't a very good Cardinals team. They had just fired Frankie Frisch, actually, as their manager, the guy who had coached them to the 1934 World Series victory. He had kind of worn out his welcome, and they had some good players. Enos Slaughter's in that game, Pepper Martin, Joe Medwick, Johnny Mize. They're all in there. And Dizzy Dean's younger brother, Paul, pitched a shutout. He was coming back from an injury. So it was a good day for them. Medwick hit a home run somehow through all those winds. What I love about that is that on a good day, wind was a problem at Braves Field in Boston. Braves Field was also known as National League Park and for a while, in fact, at this time as the Beehive, because the Braves, I'm calling them the Braves for simplicity's sake, but they were called the Bees because in 1935 they had kind of the season the Orioles are having now, and they decided to distance themselves from that by changing the name for a while. It never caught on, and they reverted, but at this time it's the Beehive. It's kind of still there, by the way. Boston University took it over and turned it into a football stadium, and they kept bits of it. It's called Nickerson Field. You can actually see it if you're driving along the Charles River in Boston. You can see the floodlights and so on. But some of the grandstand is there, and some of the gate is still there. It's all of a mile away from Fenway Park. It had opened in August 1915, and it was always an extreme pitchers park. The owner at that time, James Gaffney, really liked triples, and so he built the park, intentionally built it huge. So the opening day dimensions were 403 feet down either line and 550 feet to the deepest part of center field. There were nearly 11 acres of playing surface. And my favorite anecdote about the ballpark was that at some point right around the time it opened, Ty Cobb dropped by, looked around and said, well, one thing's for sure, nobody's ever going to hit a ball out of this park. And for almost 10 years, he was right. It didn't even happen in batting practice. The first over-the-fence home run to left field came on May 28th, 1925, and it was hit by Frank Snyder, who was a catcher for the Giants. I should add, and this is why I bring this up, it wasn't just the dimensions, which, as the lively ball came in and they began to slowly understand, Gaffney was long gone by this point, that people kind of like this home run thing. They started to move them. They started to move them constantly. They moved them in the off season. They moved them during the season, which is illegal now. It didn't change much because of the atmosphere, the environment. The ballpark, as I alluded to earlier, was built almost right on the Charles River. There was a train yard and a whole bunch of train tracks separating the ballpark from the water, and then the water itself. And it turned out that the wind liked to blow in cold off that river, and it would just take any fly ball that was hit out towards the water, and the home plate did face the river, and it would just knock it down. Casey Stengel, who managed the Braves from 38 through 43, and in fact, during these games that we're talking about today, called that Old Joe Wind, my fourth outfielder. That didn't stop him, by the way, from giving his players grief about how the ballpark worked. When his players would complain that the conditions at the park made hitting impossible, he'd say, "Oh yeah, impossible. Mr. Hornsby played here in 1928 and he hit only 387. And there probably wasn't much that anyone could say back to that. But even Hornsby was stopped by the park and the wind. We know that now that we have home road splits. He hit 372 in Boston, just 401 on the road. So the park did take a chunk out of what he did. And even then, he benefited from the one alteration that they made to the park that actually did change the way the park played. At the beginning of the 1928 season, they added some bleachers down the left field line and in left center that cut something like 70 or 80 feet off the distance down the line. And now all of a sudden, home runs to left were too easy. On June 2nd of that year, third baseman Les Bell, who hit all of 66 career home runs in about 900 games, shot 3 home runs and a triple into or off of those bleachers during a 2011 loss to the Cincinnati Reds. I don't know if they even had seen 2 2011 games in the history of that park. The Braves being the Braves, they pulled out the seats at that point and split the distance to the old fences. So instead of 400 or 300, it was 350, but pretty much it reverted at that point. It still took like 2 swings at the ball to hit it out to left, given the distance and the wind. Well, on September 21st, 1938, they started the second game, but conditions rapidly decayed and everybody except home plate umpire Beans Reardon was getting a little antsy about it, and both the Cardinals and the Braves, or Bees, were saying, listen, we gotta call this thing. We might be in a bit of danger, what with the skies having this strange, ominous yellow cast and, trees and cats and dogs and horses sailing by in the sky. And Reardon didn't want to call it. There are other games during this period when Casey Stengel was trying to get a game called on account of darkness or rain, and he went out and signaled the umpire with a railroad lantern or a flashlight or came out in a rain slicker with an umbrella. And yeah, he got run at those times, but he didn't pull any of those stunts on September 21st because they would have been purely redundant, and yet they played on. By the time the Cardinals batted in the top of the third, the wind had picked up quite a bit, and yet Reardon was being quite stubborn. They begged him to call it off, and he said, "When the advertising signs go down, that's when I'll call it." As it turned out, he didn't need that much persuasion. As that inning got underway, a Cardinal popped out to second base. The Braves second baseman, Tony Cuccinello, called for the ball. I got it. And the ball was caught, but not by him. It was caught by catcher Al Lopez, behind home plate, near the wall. It had been blown that far astray. And I guess at that point, it finally reached Beans Reardon that there was a hurricane on, and the game was called. And this is my favorite part. Right after that, the advertising signs did come down. It's all a joke now, but Boston got very lucky that day. A few turns or twists of the hurricane in one direction of the compass or another, and the map of Boston might not look the way it does today. As it is, there are still scars from that hurricane visible on the landscape in other places. And I think the real interesting point is this, that Beans Reardon gives us evidence of what happens in the total absence of government. One meteorologist with the National Weather Service
wanted to warn the people of New England that that hurricane was coming, and he got shouted down. And so there was no warning. And that left the decision, potentially a life or death decision, in the hands of an umpire in terms of whether to keep playing, to keep the teams on the field, to keep himself on the field, to keep the fans in the seats if they so chose. And that's evidence of the kind of thing that can happen when those who are elected to look out for us and supervise those who look out for us screw up or abdicate. You know, Ronald Reagan got a lot of mileage out of a line where he said that the scariest words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." It is funny. Ronald Reagan was a funny guy. But the truth is there are times you need it. And when you don't have it, people can die. Never scoff at competent government. Those children who died on September 21st, 1938 would tell you if they could. By Herbert Hoover's Hernia of the Soul, we have come to the end of another program. You can follow...
As
Stefan
ever
Johnson.
in these reissue episodes, this is where I used to tell you how to follow the guests on Twitter, but I am no longer on Twitter, and neither are you. Thus, I am left only to say, please follow me at stephengoldman.bsky.social, where I post frequently. And here's a cliche for you. If you're listening on YouTube, hit that like and... I can't do it. Hit that like and subscribe button. I'm not making light of anyone who makes a living that way because, wow, you've accomplished something. It's just that I never imagined myself saying it.
So email us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Go to Facebook, search Infinite Inning, knock. I will let you in. Everybody's doing it. And a splendid time is guaranteed for all. And of course, if you have a spare moment, please go to the podcatcher of your choice, rate, review, and subscribe. It helps bring attention to the program. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, then volunteer for your local PTA bake sale, as long as you save me a cupcake. We have a sponsor now, but nevertheless, this episode is brought to you by the number 25. Our producer is Disabled List Dan Golightly. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have in fact been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring. Dr. Rick Mooring is at the Motel 6. He'll leave the light on for you and then go off to stay at his actual hotel. Well, if my plea agreement doesn't come through, then I suppose I'll be back next week with more tales and discussion from inside the Infinite Inning.
That's all from Squeaky Me in the past. Thanks for dropping by, and join me tomorrow for a new episode of the Infinite Inning. Safe travels, friends.